Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. Today we're taking a fascinating and deeply structured look at a specific theological text. We are going to analyze a biblical blueprint for marriage. Think of it literally like architecture. If you want a building to stand strong and actually function properly, you've got to follow the designer's blueprint. So today, we're going to objectively map out this entire theological framework, exploring exactly how the source material argues that true marriage was designed to function, not as this endless pursuit of personal happiness, but as an institution of radical selflessness. To get through this efficiently, we've broken the source material down into 5 main sections. First, the problem of self-seeking. Second, how the text redefines God's hierarchy. Third, the cycle of selflessness. Fourth, what happens when couples are unequally yoked. And finally, some warnings for the unmarried.
All right, starting right off with part 1, the problem of self-seeking.
The speaker in our source material comes out swinging with a major foundational critique right from the start. They argue that the modern challenges we see in marriages actually begin long before the wedding day. According to the text, modern society essentially brainwashes people from a young age into viewing relationships completely through the lens of personal happiness. We're taught to just ask, well, what makes me happy? This creates a total consumer mindset. People enter marriage looking for that one magic person who will endure all their flaws and cater to their needs. The theological blueprint, however, demands a contributor mindset. Instead of just searching for the right person to benefit from, the framework asks a tough question. Are you actively working on becoming the right spouse? Are you actually bringing selflessness to the table, rather than just consuming what your partner offers?
Which brings us right into part 2, God's hierarchy redefined.
If the foundation of the building requires selflessness, what does the actual structure look like? Well, the source outlines a very specific framework, but argues we often misinterpret it by using worldly dictionaries to define biblical terms. The core structural pillar of this theology comes straight from Ephesians chapter 5. It reads, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her." The speaker makes it very clear that this hierarchy is completely non-negotiable within this belief system. God has set it in stone. But the absolute critical piece of the puzzle here is understanding what these roles actually entail.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the radical difference it highlights between earthly headship and divine headship. In the worldly definition, being the head means being the boss, right? A dictator with ultimate privilege, where everyone caters to your comfort. But the kingdom definition flips this completely upside down. In this biblical framework, the highest position requires the most sacrifice. It's a position of service, of getting your hands dirty, and of ultimate sacrificial giving. To prove this point, the source points to Matthew chapter 20, where Jesus says, "Whoever desires to be great among you, let him become your servant." Think about the famous example from John 13, where Jesus washes the dirty feet of his disciples. Back then, the dirtiest work was strictly reserved for the lowest servant, yet the Lord of all performed it. Therefore, according to this blueprint, a husband's headship absolutely does not mean sitting on a throne while the family serves him. It means he's the very first one required to sacrifice and serve his bride.
The speaker actually traces the origin of this structural design all the way back to Genesis 3, right after the fall in the Garden of Eden. The interpretation offered here is that God instituted male leadership primarily as a mechanism of protection. The responsibility of leadership was handed to the husband so that he could guide his wife through loving sacrifice, not through force. In this kingdom blueprint, dominance and authority are earned strictly through love and sacrificial service, ensuring the wife is safe and protected.
Okay, now that we have those definitions clear, let's move to part 3, the cycle of selflessness.
When both partners are actually following this specific theological design, here is how it's supposed to function. The text outlines this really beautiful, divine, positive feedback loop. Step 1, the husband serves and loves his wife sacrificially, just like Christ. Step 2, because she is fiercely loved and protected, the wife finds it incredibly easy and joyful to submit to his leadership. And step 3, because she's so supportive and submissive, the husband finds sacrificing for her even easier. It just loops. This mutual service actively kills the ego. When executed correctly, the source argues, this blueprint completely prevents the marriage from turning into a toxic battleground for authority. But this brings us to a pretty harsh reality check presented by the speaker. A lot of people claim their marriage is perfect simply because, well, they are happy. The source calls out this blind consumer mentality, the person who assumes everything is perfectly fine while completely ignoring their spouse's exhaustion. If you're comfortable, is it just because your spouse is being crushed by the weight of serving you while you offer nothing in return?
The text challenges believers to constantly ask themselves, is my spouse actually thriving? Am I making their role easier?
So that's the ideal scenario. But what happens when the building construction doesn't go to plan? This leads to one of the most sobering questions in the explainer. What if your spouse just isn't participating? What if you're following the blueprint to the letter, but your partner has totally abandoned the job site?
Which forces a pivot in our narrative right into part 4, when unequally yoked.
The speaker directly addresses the intense structural stress of difficult marriages, particularly those where one partner is an unbeliever, is lukewarm, or just flat out refuses to follow these biblical roles. And the mandate derived from the text here is strict and uncompromising. The roles established in the blueprint, they are not conditional on your spouse's good behavior. The speaker frames this as holding your duty post. Every individual has a personal account to settle with God, which is entirely independent of whether their partner is participating or not.
So the crucial point is that in these unequally yoked situations, the marriage blueprint becomes less about joy and way more about profound obedience. It essentially becomes a cross to carry. Husbands are still commanded to sacrificially love wives who are entirely unsubmissive or even rude. Wives are still required to submit to husbands who failed to love them properly, provided it doesn't force them into sin. In this scenario, the text explains that your marriage transforms into a mission field. Your steadfast, faithful conduct at your duty post might be the exact tool God uses to eventually win over your unbelieving spouse. Now, having covered the ideal blueprint and the realities of structural failure, we arrive at our final section, warnings for the unmarried.
In this application phase, the speaker offers some really intense advice for singles who are currently picking a site for their relational building. First, they clear up a massive misconception about what a submissive helpmeet actually looks like, using the story of Sarah and Abraham. Look, even though Sarah honored God's hierarchy by viewing Abraham as her leader, it wasn't a dictatorship, not at all. In Genesis 21:12, when they disagreed, God explicitly told Abraham, "Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice." This perfectly illustrates that kingdom hierarchy includes deep mutual respect. A godly husband recognizes that God blesses his wife with discernment and wisdom, and he actively benefits by listening to her.
Therefore, when choosing a partner, the speaker delivers a stark warning. Alignment is vastly more important than just physical or emotional compatibility. Simply being in love isn't enough. If you marry someone who does not serve your king, they are not going to follow your king's blueprint. It's that simple. The source firmly argues that marrying outside of this shared framework practically guarantees immense heartache and structural failure, turning what should have been a joyful union right into a heavy cross to carry. Which brings us to our final slide and the ultimate question posed by the source material. Are you willing to let your marriage become a cross rather than the joy it was originally designed to be? The text urges immense intentionality here. By choosing selflessness over consumerism and shared alignment over fleeting feelings, the speaker argues that couples can build an unbreakable structure, literally an absolute antidote to divorce. It's a profound architectural challenge to reflect upon, whether you are selecting a partner right now or already navigating the complexities of marriage. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring the structures that shape our lives.